By the time anyone realized what was happening, the experiment was already out of control. Florida had spent decades watching the Everglades turn into a ghost town because of one snake.
Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
The silence in the swamp was deafening. No rabbits, no foxes, just pythons. So someone made a call to fight wild with wild. They introduced the honey badger, an animal that simply does not know how to quit.
Honey badgers are not just fearless, but astonishingly clever.
It sounds like a disaster waiting to happen, right? Well, it was, but not for us. The disaster was for the pythons. The 99% collapse. They laughed when Florida announced it would release hundreds of honey badgers into the wild. To most people, it sounded like another internet hoax, too wild even for the Sunshine State, which is saying a lot. But weeks after the laughter faded, something began stirring deep in the Everglades. Nests were torn apart. Massive pythons vanished overnight. Officials refused to comment. Whatever Florida unleashed out there, it might be the boldest, strangest ecological experiment the world has ever seen. But to understand why they did it, you have to understand how bad things really got. For decades, Florida's battle against the Burmese python has felt less like science and more like a slow, exhausting defeat. The Everglades, once alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of native mammals, grew quieter each year. By the early 2000s, locals began to notice it first. There were no more rabbits darting across dirt roads. Fewer raccoons were rummaging near the canals. The deer seen at dawn were vanishing. The silence wasn't peace, it was a graveyard. The invader had come silently, hidden at first among Florida's many exotic imports. In the late 20th century, Burmese pythons were the crown jewels of the exotic pet trade. They are beautiful, impressive, and completely unmanageable once fully grown. We are talking about a snake that can grow to 20 feet long and weigh as much as a linebacker. Many were released by overwhelmed owners who realized they couldn't feed a predator the size of a telephone pole. But the real turning point was 1992. When Hurricane Andrew tore through the state, it destroyed a massive breeding facility, scattering reptiles into the swamps like seeds in the wind. They adapted frighteningly well. The Everglades offers the perfect mix of heat, water, and endless food. By the time the state realized what it was facing, it was already too late. The snakes, massive, cunning, and nearly invisible in the marsh, had begun to breed uncontrollably. Here is the scary part regarding the math. A single female python can lay up to 100 eggs a year. Multiply that by years of unchecked growth, and suddenly a handful of escaped pets had turned into an ecological army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Florida's scientists and wildlife officials threw everything they had at the problem. They launched bounty hunts, paying people by the foot to bring in skins. They trained dogs to sniff out snake scents, which is dangerous for the dogs. They even equipped captured Judas snakes with tracking devices to lead them to breeding balls. Nothing worked for long. The reptiles always seemed one step ahead, melting back into the wetlands. The devastation was absolute. A study showed that in some areas of the Everglades, the population of raccoons had dropped by 99%. Marsh rabbits were effectively extinct in the area. Bobcats were starving. The pythons were eating everything, including alligators. To the people who lived there, the Everglades began to feel cursed. One park ranger recalled, "You used to see otters playing in the creeks. Now it is just grass and water. The snakes took the sound away." But desperation breeds innovation, or in this case, madness. By the late 2010s, whispers of unconventional ideas started making rounds in state offices. Officials were desperate for something, anything that could break the python's dominance. They had tried human hunters, mechanical traps, chemical lures, even infrared drones. None of it made a dent. The pythons kept breeding, moving, and adapting. So when someone half-jokingly brought up the idea of introducing honey badgers, those infamously fearless, snake-killing carnivores of Africa, people laughed. The thought was absurd. Drop aggressive mammals into a fragile ecosystem? It sounded impossible. But then again, the python itself had once been thought harmless. What began as a joke in an internal meeting soon lingered in people's minds longer than expected. The honey badger, after all, was no ordinary animal. It was the only thing on Earth crazy enough to take this job. But if they were going to do this, they needed to be sure the cure wasn't worse than the disease. Project R18 begins. No one remembers exactly who said it first. Some claim it came from a wildlife biologist half joking during a late-night strategy call. Others say it was whispered by a veteran ranger, the kind who had seen too many failed hunts and too many disappearing species. But one phrase kept echoing through the conversation that day. Maybe we need to fight wild with wild. In that moment, the seed of Operation Badger was planted. The idea was both absurd and brilliant. A controlled introduction of honey badgers into specific python breeding zones deep within the Everglades. On paper, it sounded reckless, but desperation has a way of making the impossible seem reasonable. The scientists who studied the plan described it as biological chess. If the Burmese python was an apex predator that outsmarted humans, perhaps the solution wasn't more humans, but another predator just as cunning. Let's look at the contender. The honey badger, or Mellivora capensis, was the perfect contradiction, barely 3 feet long yet feared by lions. Its skin is the stuff of legend. It is incredibly thick and rubbery, so loose that if a predator bites the badger on the neck, the badger can literally turn around inside its own skin and bite back. It shrugs off bee stings, porcupine quills, and even machete blows. But the real game changer for Florida was its resistance to venom. The honey badger has evolved a specific genetic mutation that prevents snake neurotoxins from paralyzing it. If a cobra bites a honey badger, the badger might pass out for an hour, take a nap, and then wake up and finish eating the snake. They are nature's tanks, and most importantly, they do not know fear. Of course, the suggestion triggered laughter and outrage. Environmentalists warned it could create a new invasion nightmare. Lawmakers dismissed it as a fantasy born of frustration. Online, it became a running joke, another chapter in Florida's strange history of wildlife experiments. We all remember the cane toad disaster in Australia, right? Humans have a bad track record of playing God. But behind closed doors, a handful of researchers couldn't shake the thought, what if they could manage it safely? What if they microchipped every animal, released only a sterile male population at first, or monitored every move with satellite collars? It wouldn't be reckless, it would be targeted. Unofficially, the whispers say a proposal made its way to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission under a coded name, Project R18. It outlined a limited, secretive trial, a few dozen honey badgers imported under special research permits to be observed in isolation within secured tracts of the Everglades. The goal? To study territorial behavior, predation on reptiles, and ecological compatibility. Publicly, the commission never confirmed it, but insiders recall strange shipments arriving under heavy regulation. Temporary holding pens appeared in restricted zones. Researchers vanished into the swamps for weeks, returning tight-lipped and covered in mosquito bites. One biologist later described it anonymously in an interview. We didn't call it Operation Badger then, but we knew what we were testing. We were looking for something that could stand its ground, something that didn't run when it saw a 20-foot snake. Ethically, the debate was fierce. Were humans about to repeat the same mistake, introducing one foreign species to solve the damage caused by another? The same pattern that had doomed countless ecosystems before, and yet even critics admitted something had to change. If we do nothing, one researcher said, the Everglades will just become the Ever-Python. Operation Badger, whether rumor, experiment, or quiet reality, wasn't born out of madness. It was born out of exhaustion, hope, and a faint belief that maybe, just maybe, nature could still fix itself with a little help. They weren't looking for a pet. They were looking for a monster to kill a monster. But bringing an African predator to an American swamp brings a whole new set of problems. A new apex predator. A hunter in Collier County was the first to mention it. He found a python carcass torn open, not sliced by a knife, but ripped apart, its insides scattered like it had been mauled by a bear. But there are no bears in that specific part of the swamp. He thought maybe a gator had gotten to it until he noticed the claw marks. They were too small, too sharp, and too deliberate. Gators bite and roll. They don't shred like that. Then came more reports. Airboat guides began finding shredded nests, python eggs crushed and half-eaten. A group of trappers stumbled upon tracks they couldn't identify. 5 toes, heavy digging marks moving low and fast through the mud. The pattern didn't match raccoons or bobcats. It looked almost foreign. It looked like something that marched rather than scurried. At first, nobody paid much attention. Florida's wilderness is full of mysteries, and the Everglades has a way of hiding its secrets under a thick layer of heat and silence. But when the sightings started piling up, odd noises at night that sounded like a grinding growl, flashes of white-striped backs under the moonlight, locals began whispering again, "Something is out there," one park ranger said, "and it doesn't run from anything." Wildlife officers tried to calm the rumors. They blamed the reports on misidentifications, maybe otters or large skunks, but those who had lived near the swamp for decades knew better. "I have seen every animal in this state," said an elderly trapper from Homestead. "Whatever that thing was, it wasn't one of ours." Then came the footage. A motion-triggered trail camera set up by a group of volunteer researchers caught a brief, blurry clip, a small, muscular creature dragging something massive across the mud. It paused for a second, lifted its head and glared at the lens, 2 beady eyes flashing before it vanished into the darkness. The stripes were faint but visible. It was dragging a 10-foot python like it was a piece of spaghetti. The clip went viral within days. The internet dubbed it the Florida Honey Badger Tape. Some laughed, others gasped, but the experts mostly stayed silent. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission released a short statement calling the video inconclusive. No confirmation, no denial, just silence. Meanwhile, python hunters noticed something they couldn't explain. Fewer snakes. Not gone, but fewer. In some areas, catches dropped by nearly a third within a single season. Eggs that would normally hatch by the hundreds simply disappeared. Coincidence, maybe? Or something else entirely. One local biologist described the feeling best. It was like the swamp was breathing again. For the first time in years, it didn't feel overrun. Yet along with the strange relief came unease. People began hearing low growls at night near the canals. A few campers swore they saw black and white shadows moving in pairs, fast and silent. The story spread like humidity everywhere, impossible to contain. And then, just as suddenly as the reports had surged, officials went quiet. No new press releases, no interviews, even rangers were told to stick to known species in their logs. To outsiders, it looked like typical Florida chaos, another online myth to join the ever-growing list. But to those who lived close to the swamp, it felt different this time. Something had changed. The Everglades felt alive again, but not in the way anyone expected. The laughter that had followed Florida's crazy honey badger idea was fading, replaced by a mix of wonder and fear. Because if the rumors were true, if even a fraction of them were real, it meant someone had done the unthinkable. They had let the wild fight back, but the government couldn't keep a secret this big forever. Controlling the chaos. For months, people argued about whether the stories were real. Was Florida really crazy enough to let hundreds of honey badgers loose? Or was it just another swamp legend that the internet had turned into clickbait? Then something unexpected happened. A leak. It started with a small Florida environmental forum where an anonymous user posted a few pages of what looked like internal memos. The documents mentioned R18, the same project name whispered in research circles. They contained words like micro-tracking units, controlled release zones, and predatory interference studies. At first, no one believed it. The pages could have been fake, but then came the kicker. A grainy photo of a honey badger wearing a tiny transmitter collar crouched beside what was clearly a dead python. That single image changed everything. Journalists jumped on it. Environmental bloggers dug deeper. And within weeks, the quiet rumor of Operation Badger started sounding less like a conspiracy and more like a fact. From what pieced-together reports suggest, the project wasn't nearly as chaotic as the memes made it sound. It wasn't hundreds of honey badgers rampaging through Florida. It was a controlled ecological test. Small numbers, closely monitored, isolated in parts of the Everglades where python activity was highest. Each honey badger was tagged with GPS and health trackers. Their movements were logged, feeding patterns recorded. The idea wasn't just to kill snakes, it was to study how two top-tier predators would interact in the same ecosystem. Could a natural rival make the pythons retreat, or at least disrupt their breeding cycle? The early results, if the leaks are to be believed, were shocking. In the first 6 months, python nests in the monitored areas dropped by nearly 30%. Hatchling survival rates plummeted. Drone footage allegedly showed badgers raiding egg clusters and hunting juvenile snakes, something no other local predator had dared to do. And it didn't stop there. The ripple effect started spreading through the food chain. Small mammals, rabbits, possums, even a few foxes began returning to regions they had been absent from for years. The Everglades wasn't healing overnight, but the balance was shifting. Still, there was one thing the data couldn't explain. The honey badgers weren't behaving exactly like their African cousins, they had adapted. Instead of forming wide territories like they did in the savannas, they stuck close to water routes and dense vegetation, becoming nocturnal hunters that thrived in the cooler swamp nights. They learned fast, avoided human zones, and mostly focused on snakes and small reptiles. To the scientists, that adaptability was both thrilling and terrifying. It meant the experiment was working, but also that it might have consequences no one could fully predict. When the first hints of success reached the higher-ups, the tone inside the department shifted. Suddenly, the same project everyone had dismissed as a joke became a sensitive topic. Press inquiries went unanswered. Field reports were redacted. One internal email, later leaked, simply read, "No external communications. Continue observations. Public interpretation is unpredictable." In other words, don't let this story get out because people will freak out. But by then, it was too late. Too many people had seen too many things. Hunters, park rangers, even a few tourists had spotted what they swore were honey badgers. Small, bold, unbothered by humans. And the strangest part? None of the researchers or wildlife officials ever publicly denied it. Not once. When pressed, they would offer a carefully rehearsed line. Florida has a diverse and dynamic ecosystem. Many species exhibit unexpected behavior, which is basically bureaucratic code for we aren't saying yes, but we aren't saying no. So maybe the truth is this. Florida didn't unleash hundreds of honey badgers like the headlines claimed. Maybe it was dozens or fewer, but it was enough to tip the scale in a fight that humans were never winning. Enough to make the Everglades breathe again. But nature doesn't just reset, it reacts, and the reaction was just beginning. The unintended consequences. Once the shock wore off, the bigger picture started to come into focus. Something had shifted in the Everglades. Whether or not people believed the stories about honey badgers, the swamp itself seemed to be reacting. It began with the birds. For years, wading birds like herons and egrets had struggled to nest in areas dominated by pythons. The snakes raided eggs, devoured chicks, and cleared entire rookeries. But slowly, researchers noticed a change. In several python-heavy zones, nests were returning, dozens of them. The calls of fledglings echoed again in places that had been silent for a decade. Then came the mammals. Night cameras started catching flashes of movement. Raccoons, opossums, marsh rabbits, creatures that had all but vanished were sneaking back, cautiously at first, then confidently. Their numbers weren't booming, but they were surviving, and that alone was progress. Ecologists call this the landscape of fear. It's a scientific concept where the mere presence of a new predator changes the behavior of the prey. The pythons, once the kings of the swamp who could sleep anywhere they wanted, were suddenly looking over their shoulders. They were no longer moving with the same arrogance. Their hunting trails were changing. Their nests were scattered. Trappers found more abandoned eggs, more half-eaten clutches. Something was keeping them on edge. What is fascinating is that the honey badgers didn't take over the ecosystem like people feared. They didn't multiply uncontrollably or start attacking everything in sight. Instead, they carved out small territories, stayed near dense brush or rocky mounds, and rarely strayed too close to humans. Their presence was disruptive but controlled, and their behavior hinted at something deeper. Some were seen scavenging alongside coyotes and bobcats, species that normally competed. The swamp's usual hierarchy seemed to be rewriting itself in real time. Predators were adjusting to a new player, and prey species were cautiously taking back space. It wasn't perfect. some ecologists worried about new imbalances forming. What if the pythons fled one zone only to overwhelm another? What if the honey badgers started hunting endangered reptiles like the gopher tortoise? But the data, limited as it was, painted a more nuanced picture. Less domination, more balance. A tug of war, not a collapse. Even the landscape changed subtly. Honey badgers are natural diggers. They burrow deep and turn over soil as they hunt for food. Over time, that digging helped aerate swampy patches that had become stagnant. In a strange way, their tunnels became tiny arteries, helping the wetlands breathe again. To those studying it, the Everglades had always been a place of contradictions, life thriving on the edge of survival. But now, for the first time in years, there was a hint of recovery, a messy, unpredictable, and thoroughly Floridian kind of recovery. Not everyone was celebrating, though. Environmental activists demanded transparency. They wanted official confirmation, data, ethics reports. If this is true, one conservation lawyer said, it is the biggest unauthorized wildlife experiment in American history. Still, a quiet group of field researchers stood by the results. They saw the change firsthand. The Everglades wasn't cured, it never would be, but it was fighting back, and that mattered. In one unpublished field note later leaked online, a researcher wrote, "When we first saw them in motion, darting through the reeds, fearless against the pythons, it felt wrong, like we were crossing a line. But now, when I see the birds returning, when I hear frogs at night again, I am not sure it was wrong anymore. Maybe it was nature remembering what courage looks like." Whether you call it a success or a gamble, the outcome was undeniable. The Everglades was no longer losing quietly. Nature, against all odds, had found a new rhythm. But the internet had a very different take on the whole situation. The world watches. The first spark came from that leaked internal memo, reportedly from a Florida wildlife subcontractor, hinting at a controlled species trial involving Melivra capensis. That scientific name, honey badger, was all it took. Within hours, screenshots spread like wildfire across social media. Florida man releases honey badgers into the swamp. Read one headline, another went viral. Who thought this was a good idea? The internet had found its new obsession. At first, it was jokes. Late-night hosts and meme accounts had a field day. Clips of honey badgers tearing through snakes looped endlessly with captions like, "Florida solving problems the Florida way." People laughed, tweeted, and shrugged it off as just another weird headline from the Sunshine State. But then the laughter started to fade. Documentary channels picked it up next. Wildlife experts began weighing in, not with humor, but with concern. Some called it reckless experimentation. Others described it as eco-vigilantism. One BBC biologist even went as far as saying, introducing a top predator into a sensitive ecosystem is not conservation. It is chaos dressed as innovation. And yet not everyone agreed. In Florida and even beyond, a surprising number of people defended the move. To them, it wasn't chaos, it was survival. They saw it as a bold, if desperate, response to a crisis that had dragged on for decades. The pythons had decimated native wildlife, and official removal efforts barely made a dent. "At least somebody did something," one resident said in an interview. "You can't just talk a snake into leaving." The debate spiraled. Environmental forums clashed with government pages. Conspiracy theorists claimed the project had military funding. YouTubers uploaded hour-long breakdowns of satellite imagery, convinced they could spot badger colonies hidden in the marshes. Even a few politicians jumped in, calling for investigations and public hearings. What made it more complicated was the evidence, because there was evidence wildlife footage from the Everglades showed python numbers dropping, nest counts rising, and a few grainy glimpses of unmistakably striped creatures darting across the waterline. Not clear proof, but enough to make people wonder. Then came the whistleblower interviews. One anonymous fieldworker claimed the honey badger release was part of a last resort ecological intervention, greenlit by a small group of biologists and quietly supported by private donors frustrated with government inaction. It wasn't supposed to go public, they said. We just wanted to see if nature could fight back with the right push. By the time national networks covered the story, it had already split the public in half. Some called the team heroes. Others wanted them arrested. Environmental agencies were forced to issue statements, half denying, half deflecting. Meanwhile, the meme economy kept thriving. T-shirts appeared online with slogans like "Florida Badgers, nature's last line of defense," and "Release the Badgers again." But underneath the humor was something else, a quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, this bizarre idea had worked better than anyone expected. That is when the tone shifted. The laughter gave way to a kind of uneasy admiration. People started asking the real question. If Florida's honey badger gamble worked, what does that say about everything we thought we knew about wildlife management? Because beneath the chaos, beneath the tweets and the outrage, was a deeper truth. Humans had finally done something nature usually does for itself: fight imbalance with imbalance, and whether it was right or wrong, that act forced the world to look at the swamp differently. One viral comment captured the sentiment perfectly. You can laugh at Florida all you want, but while the rest of us were writing reports, they might have actually saved a piece of the wild. But are we really ready for what comes next? The future of the swamp. You see, the question was never just about snakes or honey badgers, it was about us. It was about how far humans are willing to go to fix what they broke. Some saw the experiment as bold and necessary. Others called it dangerous arrogance. Can we truly claim to protect nature if we keep rewriting its rules? The Everglades had always been wild, unpredictable, alive on its own terms. Maybe what Florida did was reckless. Or maybe it was a reminder that balance sometimes needs a spark, even an imperfect one. Either way, the line between control and chaos blurred forever. And nature, for once, got the last word. Somewhere in the heart of the Everglades, the swamp keeps its secrets, proof that nature doesn't always need permission to fight back. The pythons are still there, but they are hiding now. The badgers are still there watching. And the rabbits? They are finally coming back. So what do you think? Was this a stroke of genius or an ecological disaster waiting to happen? And would you have pulled the trigger on Project R18? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want more stories about nature fighting back, smash that like button and subscribe.